Oh, the recording is on, we must stop this frivolity.
We must stop being funny, yeah.
Okay, let's see. In 1 minute, we will start. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are located. Thank you for attending this parallel session today. We will have three presenters and 2 presentations. Remember that each presentation will last 20 minutes, and then we will have 10 minutes for questions and answers, all right? I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes left, so you can know when you have to start wrapping up your ideas, all right? Thank you very much. We are honored to have these presenters here in this parallel room. And let's begin with the first presentation, that is Languages and Social Cohesion, Findings from a Systematic Transdisciplinary Literature Review, a presentation by Gabriela Meyer from University of Exeter. Her research interests are multilingualism, social cohesion, and language socialization and identities. We are very glad to have you here. Thank you very much for sharing with us your insights, and I hope you enjoy your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and all the team who's been organizing this, this conference. I've really enjoyed the paper so far. So what I would like today to talk about today is research that we have just published in a new book, and I have to say I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Simone Smala, a colleague who works at the University of Queensland in Australia. As we said, this is about languages and social cohesion. This links to some of the conference themes, even though it is not on intercultural communication per se, but it is very much related to it. So maybe it's just another angle to look at a similar problem. The research question that we started out with was, in what way are languages associated with social cohesion in academic articles? And clearly we had to start with definitions of languages and the definition of social cohesion. So we sort of looked at various papers and publications, and this is quite a common definition of social cohesion. Social cohesion has several dimensions. Above all, we look at how people are connected to each other, the social networks they have. They're not particularly understood as virtual or online through technology, but it also includes those, of course. I think it's important to understand that in sociology, people look at social networks in often 4 different ways. Weak networks that are with acquaintances, people we know, but who are not our friends or family. And this is often considered the social glue that keeps society together. And when we think about languages, of course, then if we use languages, we use languages and new languages and different varieties to connect to different people. Then there are strong social networks. These are usually with family and in groups, people who are very similar to us, our friends we choose and select. So these can be emotionally supportive networks, as our friends and families will give us support, but they can also become exclusive. In the worst sense, they could be related, could be gang culture or sort of criminal circles, but they could also be other exclusive groups. There are vertical ones across hierarchy levels and horizontal ones. I won't go through all the details here, but there are also resources is a big aspect of social cohesion, sense of belonging, how we trust, what kind of trust we have with different groups, and shared norms and values. When we think of languages, we looked at how do people talk about languages in terms of social cohesion. So we looked at language repertoires, and this is when I talk about languages in this talk, I mean language repertoires, including the complex and dynamic language resources that people have, that people develop in different varieties, so including dialects, accents, and so on, but also at different levels. It is understood as a communicative linguistic resource that forms part of social practice. So this is the kind of definition that we use for languages. Other considerations that linked to the definitions that we developed is also that from these kind of different publications, that there is often a limited and instrumental view of languages, but that language is also linked to identity, to norms, to language is political, and it's often contested. I mean, we all know that, of course, and it is managed in society. So what did we do in our study? This, as I said, this is a systematic literature review. We identified 285 articles through a very rigorous protocol which we then analyzed. We did a thematic analysis on this. These articles are over 50 countries, but I have to say there is an English bias, there is an American bias in this sample. So this is because the world and the academic world is as it is. So this is just a note of caution. And the methodology is explained in the book, so I won't go into this in more detail, but I will share with you what we found through our thematic analysis. We found that in the literature, there are 6 main themes related to behavioral, organizational, ideational, contextual, distributive, and emotional dimensions or perspectives. We chose this endless intermeshed loop to show that these are all intermeshed and overlapping, and it's a very complex way that these themes are related to one another. I would just like to give you now some selected findings from this study to give you a bit of a flavor, what kind of, what you can find in our book basically, but obviously I cannot go into detail. So you will see that there is a black line, sometimes with red, and some gray information from the study that we looked at. So I won't read all this. This is just basically to say we didn't pluck it out of thin air, but there is an article behind our statement. So these are kind of sub-themes that we are presenting here. So what is always very important is to look at context. And much of what I'm saying here is not new of course, or all of it is not new. This is based on articles that have been published. So in a way, we have to think about this as a sort of summary of what we know already. And we try to structure it a bit so we can better understand what we know already. So when we look at context, there are obviously, we need to take into consideration when we want to understand how languages and social cohesion are linked. We need to think about historic and current contextual situations. So it's different in every context. There are a lot of articles about migrant contexts, and there are a lot of some articles and many articles about post-colonial contexts. Obviously, in some places, these contexts overlap, and there are some other contexts as well, minority, indigenous languages, etc., etc. So we have to think about that. Context is clearly very important when we think about that, because language policy efforts can have different effects in different contexts. Very similar policy changes have been accepted and welcomed in some contexts where they have been rejected in others. So we have to think about this carefully. Language policy also, any language policy that aims to unite society or bring groups together needs to be context sensitive, therefore. One of the other themes in our research, or that we identified in our research, was the distributive factor. This is basically about who has what languages, who speaks which varieties, and what does it mean. We also found that all languages, whether they be a foreign language, an indigenous language, a minority language, a migrant language, and all these labels are controversial in themselves, of course, because we have to sort of name a group. So they have to be also looked at with caution, but all languages and language varieties, etc., can be a social resource and are used as a social resource. And I think this is an important aspect. Obviously, there are different hierarchies, etc. But what we also have found, and what is not surprising really, is that languages are very unevenly distributed. Some people have the high status languages such as English, and others have less opportunity to learn that, have less opportunity to use it and practice it, for example. So we need to think about that. So then one of the themes was the emotional themes, and this is basically about belonging, about identity, about which group do I want to belong to, language group we're talking about here, which group don't I want to belong to, and so on. So a new language in a way can open new ways of belonging to a group, but some languages, as they are not viewed so favorably, can also lead to internalization of negative stereotyping. This, for example, I would just like to read this one for you. This Somali youth group in the USA was found to feel fear, shame, and embarrassment to speak their native language, resulting in feelings of self-hatred about ethnic origin, cultural heritage, and feelings of being different. So in a way, this just shows that just learning a language and being able to use the local language is sometimes not enough, and that there are other forces at work. Especially when language and culture are under threat. And I think this links very, very much to our first keynote speaker today. If a culture feels their language is under threat, it can lead to rejection of other groups. It can also lead to exclusive groups where they, for example, keep the language to themselves because they feel there is nothing to gain and there is even a risk attached to sharing the language with others. The ideational theme is a very important one. This is often invisible. This is what we expect, what we accept as norms. That is something that we sometimes not question or take for granted. For example, some languages are viewed as useful and others are viewed as a problem. Then we can also, some languages can also be used to maintain power or to maintain power structures. So this is something that is very, very strong theme in the book and in the articles we looked at. The one theme was the behavioral themes. This is basically what people do with their languages. Do they use them to include other people? Do they use them to exclude other people? And all of this happens, of course, or do they use them to mediate between people? So, for example, the first language can be used to build trusting relationships, especially in places, in contexts where people are displaced or new, where you seek contact to those people who speak the same language or even a similar language variety to you, and there is an immediate trust between these people, which at home may not be the case, because why should you trust someone just because they speak the same language where it's normal to speak that language? But there is also the idea that strong minority language group networks can be the basis for wider weak ties. So this is the idea that if I have a strong community that speaks my own language, I'm more likely to reach out to learn the language of the local or the wider or another group. So if my language and my culture is not at risk or threatened, then I'm more likely to reach out. That was some articles showed that. So you can see there are a lot of different ways that we can look at this so that this can be played out in society. Obviously, it can lead to inclusion and exclusion. So the local language is often referred to as a link to the local community, not very surprising, because obviously that's an advantage if we can use the local language. But groups can also be marginalized despite good language skills. And I think this is a really important point, because sometimes when language is viewed in instrumental ways, it's said, well, for example, in a migrant context, if people learn the new language, then everything will be fine and they can participate, but this is not necessarily the case. It's not automatic. So I think this is an important factor that we also need to consider. What we also found in the document is that people who are bilingual, who are multilingual, are able to mediate between people and between groups, between language groups. And this is often a job that children take on, who mediate between their parents and school or authorities, etc. But obviously it's something that more people can do. And this is also something that's now been implemented or discussed in the new framework, new CEFR framework, the companion volume, where mediation is a big topic. I think this is something that is really worth thinking about. We have also found that where communities or individuals build weak and strong ties with other people, they can access resources from 2 or more language groups. So the more weak ties we have with different language groups, the more resources we can access, be that employment, be that information and knowledge, etc. We also found that there are some articles that talk about foreign languages enabling new weak ties. Obviously, when I learn a new language, I can communicate to new people, and the social networks that I build are likely to be weak at the moment, at first at least, and then they can maybe develop into deeper friendships and strong ties. Organizational is another theme. And it's interesting that there are quite a lot of articles about education. So, and maybe that's for many of us, this is not surprising as well, I guess, that multilingual school culture can create an ethos of inclusion and trust in a school. But an interesting cluster of articles talked about intensive language education being a factor in positive and socially cohesive classrooms. So if you have an intensive language learning experience with other students, it's kind of a bonding experience. We have also seen, though, that there is a power hierarchy as well, and sometimes language education can segregate communities. For example, in some contexts, modern foreign languages are expected it is expected that elites engage with this and other people less, so it can be a selection tool. Bilingual schools in some contexts can play uniting as well as segregating roles in terms of social cohesion. And this is again all context dependent. Schools can also segregate in terms of languages through tracking, streaming based on language competencies, where not knowledge necessarily is a criteria of promotion or transition to upper levels, but it is a language competence in which this knowledge has to be expressed. Then further aspects of the organizational theme is also that language policy decisions can be perceived by some groups as inclusive and by some groups as a threat. So any language policy decisions obviously it's difficult to please everyone and to come up with policies that meet everybody's expectations or hopes. So this is something we need to consider. And I think this is a very important point that I think I've alluded to before, is that prioritizing the majority language alone is not considered enough to bring about or support socially cohesive societies. So again, this is, I've looked at, I've done a whistle-stop tour around these 6 themes that we have identified in the literature. So I'm coming to my conclusion now, and I think one of the main things I want to say is that we cannot say what works and what doesn't work in any of the contexts. Or in your context, we haven't got any recipes where we can say, well, if we do this, then we have greater social cohesion. But we need to look at all these different aspects of social cohesion and see what role they play in a local context. So what we have done is we formulated a set of questions, or we offer some tools that with the hope to inspire dialogue and raise awareness of language-related possibilities and potential opportunities, as well as risk and challenges that are related to thinking about languages and social cohesion in its complexity, because I think many policy, or in some cases, policy considerations don't take into consideration this whole complexity. So we have developed questions. They are available in the chapter 5 of our book. And I think the next steps from our point of view is that we would like to explore further how languages and social cohesion are linked in different contexts, for example, contexts that you might be familiar with, and work closely with stakeholder communities in real-world contexts where several languages and respective groups are in contact with each other, who have social networks across and within the different groups, and where potentially visible or invisible tensions might occur. So if anybody is interested in such work, I would be very happy to hear from you. And I think thank you very much. Muchas gracias for listening. And yeah, pass over to Claudia.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are very glad, and we listened to very insightful comments, and I think that it is very interesting, the model that you just shared of how languages and social cohesion interact. That is, I think that for some of us is new, right? So we will have time, yes, for questions right now. If you want, you can raise your hand or open your microphone, and I will give you the floor. Or you can also type the question, and I will read it to the presenter, okay? So here we go. It's time for questions. Please, Manuela, go ahead.
Gabriela, thank you so much for this presentation. I found myself writing and taking photos and just really, really insightful and helpful for some of my work that I'm doing now. Especially, we are working with dual language learners in the American context, and are trying to actually weave intercultural competence and sociocultural competence, which is the 3rd goal after the 2 academic goals in dual language learning in the American context. And so much of what you said was really, really useful. And my question is, how shall I put that? So one important consideration for me in this context is that minoritized students are often oppressed in the educational system here, right? Quite often their languages, their cultures are actually discouraged, and they get these messages over and over again, and we try to counteract that. So what role does this socio-political knowledge that the students can develop, right, about the oppression and what they can perhaps do themselves to resist, what role does that play in the social cohesion model? And that's perhaps a really difficult question.
Yes, it is obviously a difficult question. It is an important one, and I'm not sure whether I can answer this, but I feel it is not only the role of the students with the oppressed language, because alone, how will you be able to make a difference if people are not aware in the wider context? And I think this is why we feel that this model, if we can bring stakeholders together from various language groups and various language variety groups, perhaps, and sort of explore what's going on here. Why are we looking at this language in this way and this language in this way? Why are people feeling in this way? Or even make visible how people feel about languages, because sometimes this is really, people are not aware of this. And I think we just take so much for granted when it comes to languages, that there are useful languages and not useful languages. Even students, one of the articles is about students in an Austrian context, and there were students with migrant backgrounds who said, oh, well, obviously English, French and Spanish are great languages and they're really useful, but my language and the language that my colleague here speaks, they're not useful and they're not nice and they're not good. And I think and that's the internalization that I've been talking about earlier. And I think this is where, if the language was given more respect perhaps, or just presence in a way that this is a useful language, or a language that is associated also with great writers and musicians, and I don't know what, maybe this thing could be addressed in some way. I think some of the studies showed that, especially in those contexts where lots of different languages were recognized and, well, I don't like the term celebrate that much, but respected and recognized, the ethos changed, and somehow there was more willingness to explore and try and understand. But it's obviously a long journey. It's not a quick fix, any of this.
Thank you so much, Gabriela.
Okay, thank you for your participation. There is another question here on the chat. It says, languages and social cohesion, which other factors could one put instead of languages? Which other social factors do sociologists say are important in social cohesion?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael, for this question. And this is, I'm glad you're raising this, because language is not the only factor in social cohesion, of course. Maybe I should have stressed that a bit more, but also it often overlaps with other demographic factors that might have an influence in how social cohesion plays out. For example, poverty, cultural understandings in society, etc. So I think there are lots of other factors that play a role. And I think when we go back to the definition of social cohesion, I think there, obviously, I've looked at, for example, belonging through language, but there is also belonging through other ways of belonging, of course. And one would be ethnicity, for example. There are lots of ways of belonging, or interests, social status, socioeconomic status as well. So I think there are lots of factors that play a role. We just try to look at it from the language point of view, because that's kind of our direction of work. But yes, there are lots of different ones. Resources is another important one. And this is, I think, conceptualized in this definition of social cohesion that I've given earlier. We just shone the light, basically, on what languages may have, what impact languages may have in this whole understanding. Because what we found is that sociologists often look at language in a rather simplistic way and not in its own whole complexity. And I think this is what we wanted to make visible, that language is not simply, if you learn the language, you can participate. It doesn't work like that. It's much more complex than that. So that's kind of where obviously our whole conference here about intercultural communication is also an important factor that just looks at it in a slightly different way with slightly different theoretical tools, I guess, and we use these sociological tools to look at it. I don't know whether that's a useful answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we have a couple of more questions, but I think that we have just one more minute for to start with the next presentation. So they will be typing the questions on the chat, and in case you can share with us your email. So in case a person wants to, to contact you to ask you a question, if you can do that. Do this. Okay.
Yes, I'd be very happy to take any questions by email, and I don't want to take any more time from the next speaker. So I think maybe we should go on to the next speaker.
Yes, thank you very much. So let's continue with our next presentation right now, which is entitled Expanding Intercultural Citizenship Through Intellectual Humility. Our presenters are Manuela Wagner from University of Connecticut. Her research interests are intercultural dialogue, and Michael Byram from Durham and Sophia Universities. His research interests are intercultural language teaching, teaching and assessment of doctorate. Thank you very much for sharing with us your presentation, your insights, and the floor is yours. I hope you enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you both Claudia and Gabriela for being so wonderful with the time. It's not an easy task. I very much would have enjoyed a longer conversation about your presentation as well, but hopefully we will continue all the conversations. So you already heard the title, Expanding Intercultural Citizenship Through Intellectual Humility. I'm Manuela, and I'm going to pass it over right to Mike.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, and to the conference for allowing us to present our ideas here. In the title, I would say that the key word is expanding, because what we want to do, as it says here, is take further some ideas and research in pedagogy on intercultural citizenship by adding, as it were, or expanding through research and development ideas in intellectual humility. That's the key phrase that we will explain also later, of course. So to introduce intercultural citizenship, Manuela will be giving an example, and then we will explain intellectual humility as a response to the whole notion of blind convictions. These are the key words which will come up later. And our main point is to explain why we think intellectual humility is needed in developing further work which has been done on intercultural citizenship. So if we go to the next quote, then this, in a sense, gives us a basis, as it were, gives us a significance to our work. The UNESCO quotation: whilst underscoring humanity's interconnectedness and interdependency, COVID-19 has also led to a rise in discrimination, inequality, vulnerability, putting pressure on the capacities of society for intercultural understanding. So the important word clearly here is intercultural understanding, but where solidarity and cooperation are needed more than anything else. So this means then that there are a number of key ideas here in the UNESCO quotation, which we're using as a kind of quick introduction to all of these ideas, that there's a need to, that there has been this amplification of social inequalities and vulnerabilities, the rise of xenophobia, rising gender-based violence, rising discrimination against non-citizens, denizens of a country who are not citizens of a country, and these key ideas of collaboration, intercultural communication, and within the world of the academe of interdisciplinary problem solving. So what we're trying to do in the next slide is present intercultural citizenship as a way of developing those notions of collaboration and so on. Intercultural citizenship itself is a combination of theory and practice from the world of foreign language teaching and the development of intercultural communicative competence in particular, combining that with theory and practice from citizenship education, and in particular democratic citizenship education, but expanding citizenship education, which is usually above all preparing people, young people particularly, to be citizens of a so-called nation state, to have some kind of national citizenship identification, expanding that through language and world language or foreign language education to look more internationally, and therefore to create through that combination of language education and citizenship education to create something which is internationalist orientated, which is democratic, and which we call intercultural citizenship, and therefore which responds to the need identified in that UNESCO quotation for collaborative, intercultural, and interdisciplinary problem solving. So I'll hand over now to Manuela to explain what we mean by intercultural citizenship through an example.
I muted myself. Thank you, Mike. Yes, I'm going to give an example here of a project that was developed together with Fabiana Cardetti and Mike, of course, and in consultation also with Heather Batterley, who is a philosopher and who worked quite a bit on intellectual humility, because this was part of a project, a greater project bigger project on intellectual humility. It was a unit in a German high school class in the US, in the northeast of the US, at a time when students from Germany, from Bavarian Germany, were visiting. And we worked together with the teacher. We also had sessions with the teacher on intellectual humility, on intercultural citizenship. So she was not new to that topic when she taught it. And what else did I want to say there? I think that's it for this, yes. And it was a unit that was with German, sports, and wellness. And the teacher had shared with us before that in prior visits, she was a little disappointed that sometimes the aspects of intercultural dialogue stayed a little bit on the surface. So students would not always go beyond "this is weird" when they learn something new, and then ask more questions. So that was a goal for us to really go into more depth and finding out about different cultures as well. And you can find more information about this chapter. I analyzed data of an interview with the teacher together with Jose, our keynote speaker from today, and you can find that in a book that's co-edited with Troy McConaughey and Irina Golubeva, who is here in the audience as well. Okay, so let's start with what we did with the students. You can see it on the right-hand side here. We asked the students based in America to read about sports in Germany, and they did that in the German language. The other way around for the students based in Germany who came to visit at that time to read about sports in America. As a homework, we gave them some questions, and we intentionally asked them, what do you consider odd or weird? What are the 3 things you find most interesting or surprising? Which of these facts are specific to culture? Can you find something that you would not find in your own cultural context? And then we asked them to prepare 3 questions that they will ask their colleagues, and really sort of treating their colleagues as experts of some kind. And of course, what we did here is we went after knowledge discovery in the intercultural citizenship model. Students really trying to find out more information, not making conclusions based on no evidence, basically, or their opinions, but really interpreting and relating information and thereby learning more knowledge, getting more knowledge, more information about the topic. In the next step, we asked the students to ask each other those questions that they had to prepare, and then making a table based on, we gave them a model table, and you see it below, some statements, some stereotypes about their own cultural background in terms of sports, and the other background in terms of sports. So some examples here are Americans are the best in all sports. There is no racial discrimination in sports. So that we gave to give them a little bit of a nudge to go a little deeper and look at the societal impact of sport as well. Because we don't have much time, I don't ask you what aspect we are getting after here, but I'm going after, but I'm sharing it with you. So here we were very much into the discovery and interaction part of Mike's model of intercultural communicative competence. We wanted students to talk to other students in the target language in this case, and find out more about the questions they had. They, of course, also interpreted related and thereby continue to learn more about the topic. I'm moving on to the next part. Now we really wanted them to be fact detectives. We wanted them to either confirm or disconfirm the statements that they had made in their table. And so they interviewed their colleagues, their visitors, and other colleagues as well. And they also actually went online and found more information. We said they should at least ask 5 students, and we found out from the teacher interview that they asked many, many more, that they took a trip from Massachusetts, central Massachusetts, to New York, and the whole trip they would ask each other and talk about this topic. So that worked quite well. So what we did here, of course, we gave a real nudge to do something that's often difficult in language education. For me, one of the most important aspects of Mike's model, that critical cultural awareness. So we ask students to use their logical reasoning that Mike entered in the 2021 publication of his, in the second edition of his 1997 book, and really make a judgment based on specific evidence here. And that is so critical to intercultural communicative competence, to mediation, but also to being an intercultural citizen. So here we really nudged them to do that, to say, now with all the information you learned from the different perspectives, now make a judgment and know, and that's of course part of intellectual humility. And there were several other aspects that we can talk a little bit about later, and Mike will refer to that, is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, and what you know now might not be the end of it. Based on the information you have now, that's what you think, but that might still not be the end all be all. Okay, and then the final aspect before I give back to Mike is we also asked students, what can you now do with this? How can you go out into the community and share what you learned? Have a little, it's not really an action, it's an action element of a smaller dimension, but that would be when they go out in the community, talk to other students in the school and the German students when they're back, if they have an open forum, and talk about what they learned to sort of deconstruct stereotypes that often exist, and perhaps talk about that issue of is there racial discrimination in sports? And in this case, maybe because I learned and I found that in another cultural context, I did find that now I'm more open to looking at my own context as well. So that was that action in the community, but part of intercultural citizenship, the framework that Mike introduced in 2008, that I've been finding so helpful in my own research and action research, where the students go out and do something about a societal problem in the here and now. That was it in a nutshell. I'm handing over to Mike.
Thank you. And you've emphasized quite rightly at the end that the element from citizenship education, which is very important, in intercultural citizenship is that action dimension. But part of the thinking behind intercultural citizenship are these assumptions here that it is a matter of developing internationalist attitudes rather than national or nationalist attitudes, and that what should go on in the interactions between, in this case, German students and US American students is a democratic dialogue with, again, as Manuela has just emphasized, emphasis upon critical reflection about the way one thinks, the way one's perspectives and practices have been developed. And the assumption is that that will lead to criticality and critical reflection in your own culture and to change in what we do and the actions that we take. Those then are the assumptions that underlie the work on intercultural citizenship, assumptions which we are more or less aware of. But in the next slide, some of the thinking from Michael Lynch is quoted here in particular, and philosophers working on intellectual humility challenge those assumptions. So let's look at what Lynch says. So he's not talking about, of course, language teaching or indeed education in particular, but more generally. And this is then, from this perspective, a challenge to our educational assumptions. So he says, politically speaking, this tension manifests itself as a familiar conflict between two democratic ideals. There is a tension then in the way that societies work, democratic societies work. On the one hand, one ideal is that of the committed, engaged public, citizens with convictions, citizens who are willing to lobby and vote for them, for their convictions. And democracies strive for this ideal because an apathetic electorate is an obviously ineffective electorate. So that ideal sounds clearly democratic, yet it is also an ideal that citizens should listen to and deliberate about each other's convictions. And that's the challenge, as it were, to our idea of our sort of assumption that all we need to do is set up good interactions and in a democratic context, leading to action in the community. And that needs to be challenged by this notion of convictions, which Manuela will develop rather.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to be brief because we don't have very much time. I think I was too slow with my example, I apologize. So Michael Lynch also develops in his publications about conviction, the notion of conviction being linked to identity. That means that if our convictions are challenged, our identity is challenged. It's really sometimes considered an attack to our identity, which of course has to do, social identities have to do with self-esteem and sometimes even a notion of superiority. So that can be quite problematic, of course, if we see it in that light. It becomes further problematized with the notion of blind convictions. Convictions don't need to be, and quite a few philosophers say that the result of logical reasoning. They don't need to be backed up by evidence, but they're also strongly linked to actions. So convictions lead us to either do something, and they might also prevent us from accepting a proposal to act when we should act. And that can be quite problematic, we feel. As a result, then, as I said, blind convictions can be a result of illogical positions, and they undermine our ability to solve those complex problems that we need to solve together more and more. And if you want to read more about convictions in this context, Lynch 2019's book is quite interesting. He links it also to social media. And over to Mike.
So if we now become aware that in the democratic interactions that we hope we are setting up through intercultural citizenship, if we now become aware that convictions, and in particular blind convictions, unreasoned convictions as it were, might have a harmful effect on the actions that we hope to see in the community together with other people from other cultures, then we need to take this into consideration. And the response to that is to look at this notion of intellectual humility. And here I'm not going to read all of this. Let's just look at the key words in red here. The notion that intellectual humility, of owning one's cognitive limitations, of being open-minded, of being responsive to reasons, and being aware of the effect of blind convictions and which are not reasoned. These traits are the traits that we associate with democracy. So this then takes us back again to the next slide, to the idea that intellectual humility has educational outcomes, can be linked to education. And again, the key words here are in red, that intellectual humility as developed through education will lead students to discover their own false beliefs, misconceptions, prejudices, illusions, and myths, will lead students to suspend their judgment about matters, will lead students in number 8 to demonstrate awareness of and concern for the fact that they've been socially conditioned into the belief systems and worldview of their culture and nation. And I've highlighted there those things which correspond but expand, and that's the key word from our title, expand some of the thinking which lies behind intercultural communicative competence, critical cultural awareness, and intercultural citizenship. So intellectual humility helps us to become much more precise about some of the notions that we've been working with in recent years. Next slide would mean then, next slide.
Is this okay? Or would you need this one? Okay.
There we are. So there we see then, in a sense, a repetition of what I've just said, that you can see on the left-hand side a quotation from that list that I've just had, and on the right-hand side, the corresponding definition of critical cultural awareness. So all of this, we hope, will lead us to better practice, and that in our development of intercultural citizenship and intercultural communicative competence. Manuela.
Thank you so much, Mike. And yeah, what this means for practice is really that engaging with different opinions more and more is really crucial in today's world, where we have so many opposite views that of groups of people that don't talk with each other anymore and that create conflict and don't solve problems. So intercultural citizenship, in quite a few projects, we have shown that students can reflect on their values and beliefs through intercultural citizenship. And now we would like to expand on this, as Mike said, and take it a step further and plan curriculum that helps students question their own convictions through carefully planned curriculum, by introducing critical cultural awareness, of course, and intercultural citizenship, intellectual humility, and importantly, and the colleague in that book that I mentioned in the chat also mentioned the trust and the space that you develop in a dialogic environment that we often use in intercultural citizenship education. Thank you very, very much for spending this time with us. And I'm going to stop share.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting, insightful ideas, and for sharing with us the notion of convictions, of intercultural humility. I guess that for some of us this is like also new concepts, right? So thank you so much. And now it's time for questions, maybe a couple of questions. And if you want, you can type the questions, as I already said, or you can open your microphone to ask questions. It says, Rancy, writes on the chat, by approaching intercultural citizenship this way, aren't we maintaining the very nationalist and essentialist conceptualizations of culture and otherness that we should rather transcend? In other words, by making a necessary link between otherness and nationality, we simply end up reinforcing national borders and reducing intercultural contact to merely learning about the other. Apologies if the question is ambiguous.
Mike, would you like to take this?
Okay. What we deal with in foreign language education is others who are
and I'm actually happy to say something as well from the practice. So
usually, not always, but in the example
many of the intercultural
from another country. That doesn't
based
working on intercultural competence in other subject areas where other boundaries exist. I don't think one can explain away or how shall I put it, imagine that there are no boundaries. These boundaries exist, and they within societies as well as between societies. Boundaries which need to be handled. There is, of course, an issue of saying, okay, the Germans, the Americans in our example, but that's got to be seen in the wider context of how intercultural competence and citizenship is something that takes place across the whole curriculum. And that was something that we have also discussed and worked on in a recent book, copies of which I have in almost in my hand. Here, for example.
Oh, yes. If I may add to this, actually, so in the example that we used, where, of course, you know, there were the American-based students and the German students, one of our goals was to deconstruct those national stereotypes, of course, and through intellectual humility, and there were a number of activities that we designed for this, students understood that they themselves don't understand many things about sports in their own context, that there are many differences within their own context, and so on. And that's, of course, always an important goal in this type of dialogue as well.
Thank you very much.
Somebody's asking to see the list of references again, but I think the best way would be for us to share our emails and then send you the list of references.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
happy to
please. Yeah, thank you
was,
very much. There is another question here. It says, thank you for the presentation. I'm doing a research on intercultural training using ICC 5 factors model. The training focuses on ICC in the language context. I wonder if you would recommend add intercultural humility into intercultural training as well. Thank you.
Absolutely, will be my answer. I think one thing I would want to make clear is that this notion of blind convictions is particularly for me new and helpful. And I have the weakness of being a rationalist and thinking that people can interact on a rational basis. Indeed, I think they can, I hope they will. But the blind conviction idea makes me think more carefully about the way in which people do reason or do not reason and how that has an impact upon their actions. So that's what I think is particularly helpful about intellectual humility, that emphasis upon being aware of the power of blind convictions. And all of that can certainly be brought into the training program that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. There are some other questions here, but I don't think that we have enough more time, I will read some of the comments. Everybody saying thank you for your presentation. Professor Jose Aldemar says, thank you for the presentation, Manuela, Mike. I am happy to see how intercultural communication is establishing interdisciplinary connections with other areas that will help us understand better this phenomenon. So I would like, before we finish, because remember that we will have a lunch break from 11:50 to 1:30 p.m. In Colombia's time. So I would like to take a screenshot in order, for the for the event. So if you can kindly, I don't know, just let us see your faces. It'll be good so we can take the picture. Thank you very much for all the people that attended, for questions, for the presenters. We are very happy to have you here. So let me take, this is one, and I'm gonna take another one right now. Okay, there's only one. Smile, please. Thank you. Okay, here we go.
And I'm going to put our the email address, Mike. Perhaps should we put it in the chat? And thank you so much for the questions, everyone.
Yes, please, because I guess that there are some extra questions, but since the time is very limited, so thank you very much. Okay, so thank you, everyone. See you at 1:30 p.m. Thank you, Manuela, Gabriela, and Michael.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and great to see everyone.
Okay, thank you.